At the end of the 19th century, when the British Empire stood at the peak of its global dominance and London was widely regarded as the most powerful city on earth, a symbol of progress, industry, and human achievement, there existed a side of the city that was deliberately ignored, a hidden world where the promises of prosperity never arrived, where the streets were not lined with opportunity but with desperation, and where survival itself was a daily struggle, because while the western districts of London dazzled with wealth, architecture, and innovation, the eastern side, particularly the district known as Whitechapel, told a very different story, one of overcrowded slums, unbearable poverty, disease, crime, and neglect, a place where thousands of men, women, and children lived crammed into decaying buildings, sharing limited resources, surrounded by filth, and constantly on the brink of starvation. And it was within this environment, this chaotic and forgotten corner of one of the greatest cities in the world, that a shadow emerged, silent, calculated, and terrifying, a figure who would not only take lives but would leave behind a legacy of fear so powerful that more than a century later, his name still echoes through history, a name that was never truly his, but one that would define him forever, Jack the Ripper. To understand how such a figure could exist and operate undetected, one must first understand Whitechapel itself, because this was not merely a poor neighborhood, it was a place where social systems had effectively collapsed, where law enforcement struggled to maintain control, where the rapid growth of population had far outpaced the city's ability to provide housing, sanitation, or employment, and where immigrants from across Europe arrived in search of opportunity only to find themselves trapped in a cycle of poverty and hardship, competing for scarce jobs, often forced into dangerous or illegal work just to survive, and among those who suffered the most in this environment were women, particularly those who had been abandoned by their families, widowed, or pushed out of society due to circumstances beyond their control, many of whom found themselves with no options other than prostitution, a profession that existed in a legal gray area, tolerated but not protected, leaving these women exposed to violence, exploitation, and danger on a nightly basis, and because they operated in the shadows of society, their lives were often considered expendable, their disappearances barely noticed, and their deaths rarely investigated with urgency. The streets of Whitechapel at night were a labyrinth of narrow alleys, dimly lit by flickering gas lamps that cast long, distorted shadows across the cobblestones, creating an atmosphere that was both eerie and oppressive, where the sounds of distant footsteps, drunken arguments, and the occasional cry for help blended into a constant hum of unease, and it was within this setting, during the early hours of the morning when the city was at its most vulnerable, that the killer chose to strike. Moving through the darkness with a level of confidence that suggested familiarity, perhaps even comfort, as if he knew exactly where to go, exactly when to act, and exactly how to disappear without leaving a trace, and this ability to navigate the environment so effectively would become one of the most troubling aspects of the case, raising questions about who he was and how he managed to evade capture despite the increasing presence of police patrols. The first known victim, Mary Ann Nichols, was discovered in the early hours of August 31, 1888, her body lying on the ground in Bucks Row, a quiet street that offered little visibility and even less security, and at first glance, the scene may have appeared to be yet another instance of violence in a district where such incidents were not uncommon, but upon closer examination, it became clear that this was something far more disturbing. Her throat had been cut deeply, almost from ear to ear. in a manner that suggested not only intent but precision, and her abdomen had been mutilated with cuts that appeared deliberate rather than random, indicating that the killer had taken time to carry out his actions, a detail that would later become crucial in understanding the nature of the crimes. And yet, despite the severity of the attack, there were no immediate witnesses who could provide a clear account of what had happened. No one who had seen the killer, and no physical evidence that could lead investigators toward a suspect, leaving the police with little more than a body and a growing sense of unease. At the time, the murder of Nichols was not immediately recognized as part of a larger pattern, as Whitechapel was no stranger to violence, and many assumed that it was an isolated incident, perhaps the result of a drunken altercation or a personal dispute, but this assumption would soon be shattered, because just over a week later, on September 8th, another body was discovered, this time belonging to Annie Chapman, found in the backyard of a residence on Hanbury Street, and the similarities between the two murders were impossible to ignore. Once again, the throat had been cut with precision, and the body had been subjected to severe mutilation, including the removal of internal organs, a detail that introduced a new and deeply unsettling dimension to the case, suggesting that the killer possessed at least some knowledge of human anatomy, raising questions about his background. Was he a doctor, a butcher, or someone with experience in dissection, and if so, how had he managed to operate in such a crowded area without drawing attention to himself? The discovery of a second victim transformed what had been seen as an isolated tragedy into something far more alarming, a pattern, a series of murders that appeared to be connected, and as news of the killing spread, fear began to take hold of the community. Residents of Whitechapel became increasingly anxious, particularly women who worked the streets, as they realized that they were being targeted, and as newspapers began to report on the crimes, often exaggerating details and publishing unverified information. The situation escalated into a full-blown panic, with headlines fueling public fear and placing immense pressure on the police to find answers. But the more attention the case received, the more complicated it became. As rumors spread rapidly, false leads emerged, and the line between fact and speculation became increasingly blurred. As the fear continued to spread across Whitechapel and the surrounding districts, the atmosphere in London began to shift in a way that few could have anticipated, because what had started as a series of brutal but localized murders was rapidly transforming into something much larger, something that captured the imagination of the entire city and, soon, the world, as newspapers competed to publish the most shocking details, often embellishing facts or presenting speculation as truth, feeding a growing sense of paranoia among the population, and in doing so, unintentionally amplifying the power of the killer, turning him from an unknown figure into a looming presence that seemed to exist everywhere and nowhere at the same time, a phantom capable of striking without warning and disappearing without a trace. And it was precisely this combination of violence, mystery, and media attention that elevated the case into something unprecedented. The police, under immense pressure from both the public and the government, intensified their efforts, increasing patrols throughout Whitechapel, questioning witnesses, and attempting to piece together any clues that might lead to the identification of the killer. But the reality was that they were operating with significant limitations, as forensic science was still in its infancy, and many of the investigative techniques that are considered standard today simply did not exist at the time, meaning that they had to rely heavily on witness testimony, which was often unreliable, inconsistent, or influenced by fear and rumor, and as a result, the investigation became increasingly fragmented, with multiple theories emerging but none providing a definitive answer. Less than an hour later, in a different location several streets away, another body was discovered, this time belonging to Catherine Eddowes, found in Mitre Square, and the scene that greeted investigators was even more horrifying than anything they had seen before. Her throat had been cut, as in the previous cases, but the level of mutilation inflicted upon her body was far more severe, indicating that the killer had not only continued his actions but had done so with increased intensity, as if compensating for the interruption that may have occurred earlier that night, and this sequence of events solidified the belief that the same individual was responsible for both murders, reinforcing the idea that the killer was becoming more confident, more daring, and perhaps more dangerous with each passing day. By this point, the case had reached a level of notoriety that extended far beyond Whitechapel, drawing attention from across London and even internationally, and it was during this period that one of the most infamous aspects of the case emerged, the letters, because amidst the chaos and confusion, the police began receiving correspondence from individuals claiming to be the killer, or at least to have knowledge of the crimes, and while many of these letters were quickly dismissed as hoaxes, one in particular stood out, a letter addressed to Dear Boss, in which the writer mocked the authorities, referenced details of the murders, and hinted at future actions, signing off with a name that would become legendary, Jack the Ripper, and although it has never been definitively proven that this letter was written by the actual killer, its impact was immediate and profound, as it provided a name, an identity, however artificial, for the figure who had been terrorizing the city, and from that moment on, the killer was no longer just an unknown assailant, he was Jack the Ripper. The emergence of this name marked a turning point in the case, as it transformed the narrative from one of isolated crimes into a story with a central character, a figure that the public could focus on, fear, and speculate about, and this shift was further amplified by the media, which embraced the name and used it extensively in their coverage, contributing to the creation of a mythos that would endure long after the murders themselves had ceased, and as more letters appeared, including the infamous From Hell letter, which was accompanied by a piece of what was claimed to be a human kidney, allegedly taken from one of the victims. The line between reality and fiction became increasingly blurred, making it even more difficult for investigators to determine which leads were genuine and which were simply attempts to exploit the situation for attention. Amidst this growing chaos, the police continued to pursue various suspects, each of whom seemed, at least on the surface, to fit certain aspects of the profile that investigators were beginning to construct, a profile based on patterns observed in the crimes, such as the apparent anatomical knowledge, the choice of victims, and the timing and location of the attacks. And among these suspects were individuals from a wide range of backgrounds, including local criminals, immigrants, medical professionals, and even members of the upper class. But despite the extensive efforts to identify and apprehend the killer, none of these suspects could be conclusively linked to the crimes, and as time passed, the lack of progress began to erode public confidence in the authorities, leading to increased criticism and a growing sense of frustration. The situation was further complicated by the sheer volume of information that investigators had to process, as the intense media coverage and public interest generated a flood of tips, theories, and alleged sightings, many of which were contradictory or unverifiable, creating a situation in which the police were effectively overwhelmed, forced to sift through vast amounts of data in the hope of finding something meaningful, while at the same time dealing with the ongoing threat posed by the killer, who remained at large and seemingly unstoppable. As the investigation dragged on, the psychological aspect of the case began to take on greater importance, as experts and observers attempted to understand the mindset of the killer, to determine what could drive a person to commit such acts, and whether there was a pattern or motive that could provide insight into his identity. And while various theories were proposed, ranging from mental illness to ritualistic behavior, none could be definitively proven, leaving the true motivations of Jack the Ripper as mysterious as his identity. At the same time, the impact of the murders on the community of Whitechapel was profound, as residents lived in a constant state of fear, uncertain of when or where the killer might strike next, and this fear was particularly acute among women, especially those who worked as prostitutes, as they were not only the primary targets of the killer but also among the most vulnerable members of society, lacking the protection and support that might have otherwise helped to keep them safe, and as a result, many were forced to make impossible choices, weighing the risk of staying off the streets against the necessity of earning a living, a dilemma that underscored the harsh realities of life in Whitechapel and highlighted the broader social issues that had contributed to the emergence of the killer in the first place. Despite the increased police presence and the heightened awareness among the public, the killer continued to evade capture, demonstrating an ability to adapt and operate within an environment that had become increasingly hostile, and this ability, combined with the apparent randomness of the attacks, made it extremely difficult for investigators to predict his movements or anticipate his next move, further complicating efforts to bring the case to a resolution. And then, just as the city braced itself for what seemed like an inevitable continuation of the violence, everything would change once again, with a crime so shocking, so brutal, and so different from the others that it would not only redefine the case but also mark the beginning of its end, a final act that would leave investigators with more questions than answers and cement the legend of Jack the Ripper as one of the most enduring mysteries in history. And then, just as the city braced itself for what seemed like an inevitable continuation of the violence, everything changed in a way that no one could have predicted, because on the morning of November 9, 1888, a discovery was made that would not only become the most horrifying crime attributed to Jack the Ripper but would also mark a turning point in the entire case, the moment when the brutality reached its absolute peak and, strangely, when the of murders would come to an abrupt and unexplained halt, because inside a small, dimly lit room located in Miller's Court, a place that offered more privacy than the dark alleys where previous victims had been found, the body of Mary Jane Kelly was discovered, and unlike the others, this crime scene was not exposed to the public eye. It was contained within four walls, giving the killer something he had never had before: time. And it was precisely this time that allowed him to carry out an act of violence so extreme, so methodical. Mary Jane Kelly was younger than the other victims, often described as more attractive, and had managed, at least temporarily, to secure a place to stay, a small room that she rented, which in theory should have offered her some degree of safety, but in reality, it became the setting for the most gruesome crime of the entire series, because when her body was discovered, the level of mutilation was unlike anything seen before. Her face had been so severely disfigured that identification was difficult, her abdomen had been completely opened, with internal organs removed and placed around the room. Her chest, limbs, and even her features had been subjected to repeated and deliberate cuts, and the sheer extent of the damage suggested not only a loss of control but also a terrifying level of focus, as if the killer had used this opportunity to fully express whatever compulsion had been driving him, free from the risk of interruption that had likely limited his actions in previous attacks. The condition of the room itself told a story of chaos and violence, blood covering the walls, the floor, the bed, indicating that the attack had been prolonged and relentless, and for investigators, this crime scene offered both more information and more confusion, because while the indoor setting allowed for a more detailed examination, it also raised new questions. How had the killer entered without being noticed? How had he left without alerting neighbors? And perhaps most importantly, why? Did the murder stop after this? Because despite the heightened fear and expectation that more killings would follow, no further crimes were definitively attributed to Jack the Ripper after the death of Mary Jane Kelly, and this sudden silence became one of the most puzzling aspects of the case. In the aftermath of this final murder, the investigation continued, but the momentum had shifted, as the absence of new crimes meant that there were no fresh leads, no new evidence, and no clear direction, forcing authorities to rely on what they had already gathered, which, unfortunately, was not enough to identify the killer, and as time passed, the case began to grow cold, fading from an active investigation into an unsolved mystery, one that would continue to attract attention but would never reach a definitive conclusion. And yet, even as the official pursuit of the killer slowed, the theories and speculation surrounding his identity only grew stronger, fueled by both the lack of answers and the enduring fascination with the case. Over the years, countless suspects have been proposed, each with their own set of arguments and evidence, ranging from the plausible to the highly improbable, and among the most frequently mentioned is Aaron Kosminski, a Polish immigrant who lived in the Whitechapel area and was known to suffer from mental illness, displaying behaviors that some believed aligned with the psychological profile of the killer, including a deep-seated hostility toward women, and while some contemporary reports suggested that he had been considered a strong suspect by police at the time, there was never enough evidence to charge him, and he ultimately spent much of his life in an asylum, dying without ever being formally connected to the crimes. Another prominent suspect is Montague John Druitt, a barrister and schoolteacher whose body was found in the River Thames shortly after the final murder, leading some to speculate that he may have taken his own life following the killings. And while this theory has been supported by certain historical accounts, it too lacks concrete proof, relying heavily on circumstantial evidence and interpretation rather than definitive facts. And similarly, other individuals, including doctors, butchers, and even members of the aristocracy, have been suggested as possible suspects, each theory attempting to reconcile the known details of the case with the background of the individual in question. One of the most controversial and widely debated theories involves Prince Albert Victor, the grandson of Queen Victoria, with some suggesting that his alleged involvement in secret scandals may have led to a cover-up orchestrated by powerful figures within the government, a theory that, while intriguing, is largely dismissed by historians due to a lack of credible evidence and conflicting records that place the prince elsewhere during the time of the murders. Yet despite its weaknesses, the theory persists, highlighting the extent to which the mystery of Jack the Ripper has captured the imagination of the public, inspiring narratives that blurred the line between history and fiction. Beyond individual suspects, some researchers have proposed broader explanations, suggesting that the killings may not have been the work of a single individual at all, but rather multiple perpetrators, or even a coordinated effort linked to illegal activities such as organ trafficking, though these theories remain speculative and are often criticized for lacking solid supporting evidence, and as a result, the most widely accepted view continues to be that the murders were committed by a single, unidentified individual, whose identity has been lost to history. What is undeniable, however, is the impact that these crimes had, not only on the City of London but on the development of criminal investigation as a whole, because the challenges faced by investigators in this case highlighted the need for more advanced techniques, contributing to the gradual evolution of forensic science and investigative methods, and in many ways, the case of Jack the Ripper can be seen as a turning point, a moment that exposed the limitations of existing systems and paved the way for future advancements. At the same time, the case also revealed the power of the media, as newspapers played a significant role in shaping public perception, transforming the murders into a sensational story that captivated audiences and created a lasting cultural phenomenon, and this interplay between crime and media coverage would go on to influence how similar cases were reported and perceived in the years that followed, establishing patterns that continue to this day. Perhaps one of the most important aspects of the Jack the Ripper case is the way it brought attention to the social conditions of the time, particularly the extreme poverty and inequality that existed within London, because while the identity of the killer remains unknown, the lives of his victims tell a story that is equally important, one of hardship, resilience, and marginalization, reminding us that behind the mystery and the legend were real people whose lives were shaped by circumstances beyond their control, and whose deaths highlighted the urgent need for social reform. Even now, more than a century later, the fascination with Jack the Ripper shows no signs of fading, as new theories continue to emerge, supported by modern technologies such as DNA analysis and digital reconstruction. Yet despite these efforts, the mystery remains unsolved, a testament to both the complexity of the case and the limitations of the evidence that has survived. And perhaps it is this very uncertainty that ensures the story will continue to endure, because as long as there are unanswered questions, there will always be those who seek to answer them. In the end, Jack the Ripper is more than just a name or a series of crimes. He is a symbol, a representation of fear, mystery, and the unknown, a reminder that even in a world driven by progress and knowledge, there are still shadows that remain beyond our understanding. And as we look back on the events of 1888, we are left not with a conclusion, but with a question that has echoed through time, a question that may never be answered: who was Jack the Ripper, and will we ever truly know?